Let's go to David Gazzard from DPG Advisory and Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute. Gentlemen, great to see you both. David, this is an interesting scenario for by-elections. Obviously, New South Wales politics is the focus. It also comes at a tricky time federally with an election just around the corner as well.
I guess what it shows is there's an endorsement by people that are willing to put their hands up and run for federal parliament in the leadership of the federal coalition. They wouldn't be flocking to run to those seats if they didn't have a chance, and that's where ambition serves local members and other candidates well. They want to get a seat in federal parliament to make a difference, like Melanie, and good on her for giving it a go.
We're seeing at the moment, David, first to you on this, the climate negotiations. I've seen this movie so many times before and it falls over at the last hurdle. What do you make of it, David? Will the Prime Minister get this deal done? Will he have something credible to take to Glasgow?
I think there's a couple of important things to say about this, Kieran. It looks like it's heading in the right direction, but I don't look at this as, something that has to be done for Glasgow. I think it has to be done for Australia. And what you're seeing is the process by which the party that controls all of the regional seats in Australia, minus a couple, and all of those areas that are concerned about the cost of climate change, and they're going through an internal process that will culminate next week where they go to the party room and the joint party room. It culminates a way in which a democratic process sifts the wheat from the chaff with a large proposal like this and comes up with what they think is in the best interests of Australia. And, I think we've all seen polls this week that show that people want a sensible, pragmatic outcome that reaches the sorts of objectives that have been met and beaten with hurdles in the past, with Paris targets and so on. But they want to make sure it works for them as well, and there's not huge costs associated with it. So what we're seeing is the process by which that policy is formulated through both of the parties that form the coalition in a sensible, pragmatic way that works in the interests of all the members involved and the seats in which they represent.
Ben Oquist, that pragmatism has been rewarded in years gone by when it comes to the coalition's approach. It might get messy at times, but that's the nature of this issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the government will reach a deal with the National Party. I think the government will do net zero by 2050, and as you've been reporting, a higher projection for 2030, but not a target. That seems the likely outcome. And I think it's got to the point where the Prime Minister has to land net zero by 2050, doesn't it? It would just look ridiculous at this point if he didn't make that work. He couldn't go to Glasgow without it. He's going to struggle at Glasgow anyway with such a weak and late commitment to net zero by 2050, and that no real increase in the 2030 ambition where all the focus is. I think, though, it's probably important to look at the detail. The two really interesting interventions I thought this week were Keith Pitt, who proposed one of the most economically reckless policies I've ever seen from a minister in a government, where he suggested $250 billion to underwrite industries that the world is moving away from and would leave massive stranded assets. But perhaps more importantly, from Angus Taylor, who said on the front page of the Financial Review that offsets will help coal and gas survive. And I think that's the really interesting thing to look for in this deal that's coming is, yes, net zero by 2050, but what does it mean? And if it's going to mean a whole lot of offsets that help coal and gas survive, as under Angus Taylor's words, it's not really going to do the job. And net zero by 2050 will, in essence, be a fraud while it's propping up coal and gas. Now, no one says they have to end overnight, but the idea that we would be shoveling more money into support coal and gas while the rest of the world tries to get off it would make the Prime Minister's net zero by 2050 a fraud.
The Prime Minister has been saying, David, that the capital markets are moving, that the decision's been made, that the world is moving to this clean energy future. We've had a reminder of that again today by the chair of the Commonwealth Bank. They're not going to be funding new projects in fossil fuels. So the argument by some in the coalition that just tell those banks to leave, what were they going to tell the Commonwealth Bank? Pack your bags? I mean, it's the oldest and biggest bank in this country. Some of the arguments against this, I think, is really having their head in the sand, isn't it?
I think that's a commercial decision for the bank itself, but there's a broader policy decision that is going to affect all of Australians, all Australian business between now and 2050, between now and 2030. And that involves the transition away from those sorts of fuel sources. You've seen countries in the world at the moment where the transition has not been managed correctly and there are now power shortages. It's forced a greater reliance in those countries on coal and traditional forms of energy. So we've got to get this right. I think Keith Pitt is absolutely right when he talks about managing that process in a way that doesn't devastate jobs and industry in those areas. And he's talking about Gladstone that he represents in Queensland. And we do it in a sensible way where there is a transition of jobs into those newer industries, but we don't suffer massive shortages or huge price spikes in the intervening years. So we've got to approach this knowing that this is a target that's 30 years away, and we've got to manage the process in terms of getting there in a sensible and rational fashion.
Ben and David, we're out of time. My apologies. We've got to go.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.